Just over a century ago, half of the U.S. population was excluded from the democratic process, until the pioneers for women's suffrage showed what can be done when people say enough is enough. I spoke with journalist Elaine Weiss and the late Cokie Roberts about the American heroes who secured the women's right to vote. I'm David Rubenstein. All my life, I've been passionate about American history. I think that by learning from the past, we can better shape the future. I've spent years interviewing experts to learn more about the U.S. presidency and American power. In this series, I revisit these interviews and bring their stories to light. In a democracy like the United States of America, it's we the people who hold the power to elect our leaders, including the president. But for much of our history, women were left out of the political process. Elaine Weiss and the late Cokie Roberts explained to me why women did not have a say.
Men were used to women having a subservient role. It's in much of our religious tradition, certainly in our civic tradition. Men said, oh, no, women are too fragile. Women can't handle the rough and tumble of politics. Many said they were not bright enough. And so they were using this rather patronizing idea of what women could and could not do.
Now, to put people in the perspective of those days, women had the right to vote?
No, of course not.
Could they serve in office?
No, women couldn't do anything.
They couldn't own property?
Married women could not own property. Their property was the property of their husbands, including the clothes on their backs, the jewelry in their ears. They were the property of their husbands.
But by the mid-19th century, a new grassroots movement was growing, calling for women to obtain the right to vote. At first, despite being two distinct movements, women's suffrage shared momentum with the fight to end slavery.
The idea of women's rights actually stems from the abolition movement. And the idea of all humans having the divine spark and having the right to freedom and a voice in their government really comes out of abolition. And so these are twin causes from the 1840s until after the Civil War.
So the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in the United States is often thought to be the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848. What prompted the women to come together there?
What it is the first publicly announced conference that's dedicated to the idea of women's rights. And then there's another one in Rochester just a few weeks later, and another one in Worcester, and then they become spread around the country and they become annual.
Women agreed to put abolition first as the national cause, but expected to be included in suffrage amendments after the war. But in 1870, the ratification of the 15th Amendment granted African-American men the right to vote and left women out. This divided the suffrage movement. Some adamantly opposed the 15th Amendment and demanded a 16th Amendment for women's suffrage, while others supported the 15th Amendment and pursued a state strategy to win suffrage. And they adopted bold new campaign strategies.
They decide to conduct civil disobedience. Susan Anthony and Sojourner Truth and more than 200 other women in several elections in the 1870s do go to the polls and demand to be registered and to vote. They are trying to test the law that under the 14th Amendment, as citizens of the nation, they already possess the right to vote and they just have to exercise it. And as the face of the movement, the authorities come after Susan Anthony, and she is charged with illegal voting in a federal election and pleas to the public. Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote? And of course, she is convicted. She refuses to pay the fine. Of course, she wants to bring this to the Supreme Court. She wants to go to prison. The judge does not allow it. He doesn't want a martyr in prison. But other people do bring a case to the Supreme Court. And it's voted in around 1874 that women are citizens, but they are non-voting citizens. And so it's at that point that the suffragists realize they're going to have to do something different, and they draft an amendment to the Constitution.
But there was also an effort to go state by state in various state legislatures and get a state to approve the right for women to vote in that particular state.
Well, actually, the suffragists pursued a double-track strategy throughout. Congress sits on this amendment that's introduced in 1878. They do not act on it for 40 years. And so in the meantime, the suffragists are going state by state and trying to convince the men of the state, who are the only ones who can vote in these referenda, that they should share power with women. And they go to Theodore Roosevelt when he is president, and they say, what will it take for you, Mr. President, to support this federal amendment? And he says, there has to be enough states who have allowed women to vote, then Congress will begin to listen. They are successful, mostly in the West, and when New York State does pass women's suffrage in 1917, that's a game changer.
At that point, World War I is largely over. Was there a feeling among men that women had done a terrific job in helping the war effort, and maybe we should thank them by giving them the right to vote? Was that part of the thinking?
Yes, it was. They're not only rolling bandages for the Red Cross, they are also in the mines, they are in the fields, they are working in munition plants, they are making airplanes and tanks and ships. So this whole idea that women are too fragile to have the vote is really blown out of the water when you see women in uniform. Those old canards just don't work anymore.
In the spring of 1919, the U.S. Congress finally passed the language that would become the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. But the proposed amendment needed to be ratified by 36 states. By summer 1920, 35 states had ratified. Only one more was needed. That's when all eyes turned to Tennessee.
There are a few other states outstanding, but they're also Southern, which will also reject the amendment, and Florida, the governor refuses to call its legislature back. So it turns out that Tennessee is the last best hope.
But the suffragists descend on Tennessee, and they take over the hotels, they start lobbying.
Everyone descended on Tennessee, not only the suffrage leaders, but the anti-suffrage leaders from all around the country. So it's a wild time in Nashville. But then there's a young delegate, 24-year-old freshman delegate from East Tennessee, and he has been voting with the anti-suffragists all this time. He's up for re-election. His mentor is a rabid anti-suffragist, an anti-ratificationist in the Senate. Personally, he does feel that women should have the vote, but politically, it's very dangerous for him. And it just would be safer for him to duck and vote this down. And it comes down to this tie, 48 and 48. And young Harry Byrne realizes he can break that tie. And he has received a letter from his mother, and she's written to him and said, do the right thing, Harry, and be a good boy and vote to ratify. And in that moment, when he realizes he can kill the amendment or pass it, he has his mother's note in his breast pocket, and he changes his vote and he votes aye.
Tennessee was the last of the necessary 36 states to secure adoption. The 19th Amendment became law on August 26, 1920. It was the culmination of over 70 years of struggle for women's suffrage. But in reality, it would take many decades of continued activism for all women, specifically Black women and other women of color, to gain access to the vote.